Dann stehe ich vor einem Plakat und lese, was ich getan habe und lese und lese. Was habe ich getan? Aber ich weiß doch von gar nichts. Aber wer glaubt mir denn? Der weiß denn, wie sie mir aussieht, wie es schreit und brüllt da innen, wie ich tun muss, will nicht, muss, will nicht, muss.
We don't even speak German, but you know what scene that is, right?
That's the finale, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh my
scene.
God.
It's unbelievable.
Whenever a movie in a foreign language can like arrest you and like get you to like hear what they're saying without having to look at the subtitles, then you got an iconic masterpiece on your hands.
It's like the whole blown away. I mean, that movie, I've never seen it before. We're talking of M, of course, from 1931.
I'm so glad we found a reason for you to watch it.
I'm just like, I never would have watched it probably, to be honest. It would never be on my list to be like, I love Fritz Lang, but like it was never sort of 30s. It feels like a little bit of a trudge, but I don't know. I think it has illuminated my mind to pre-1940s cinema. Then I'm like, I really probably need to like dive into this stuff because
the 30s were wild. I mean, that's all the pre-code stuff.
Totally wild. So this is the last episode of our Manhunt series. It's Film Trace, folks, a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production, all the way to release and reception. Episode 8 of Manhunt, doing pre-1960s movies. We did Bullet and Les Samurai last week. And this week we're doing While the City Sleeps from 1956, Fritz Lang, and also his 1931, I want to say masterpiece, M. One of his masterpieces, I should say. So the end of the line, 8 episodes in Manhunt series. I was like, when we first came up with this, I was like, is this really going to work?
I know.
Because it seemed a little bit of a stretch, but like it was a fun stretch because I feel like a lot of these movies we probably wouldn't cover otherwise. And it gave us a chance to talk about some really random stuff like Apocalypse Now versus Logan's Run in the 70s, or Manhunter versus The Running Man in the 1980s. Even like the 90s episode, Cure versus One False Move. I mean, these like really bizarre pair ups that were fun to sort of like ping pong back and forth on. And we decided to do for the finale. I think we've done this once before with Wes Anderson. I think we did maybe Royal Tenenbaums and French Dispatch in a single episode. So now we're doing While the City Sleeps and M by Fritz Lang. Where should we start? How about you dive in? What is your relationship with old Fritz?
Yeah, well, I mean, I show a clip from Metropolis in class every semester. Kind of have to. It's kind of insane to think about the fact that this guy made both Metropolis and M within 4 years of each other. Because I like thinking about even like the other iconic auteurs, Hitchcock, Scorsese, like that kind of like just double masterpiece is very rare, especially so close to each other. But I think, the biggest thing that kind of also comes to mind when I think about Fritz Lang is like he has so many films and so many of them in English and then there's Metropolis, which is silent and, crosses all language boundaries. But then even M, like sometimes I forget because Peter Lorre went on to also do lots of English speaking movies. He's arguably also as iconic in The Maltese Falcon, less than 10 years later. And so it is kind of like he's the guy that not only like is huge for that transition from silent to talkies, but also for just like crossing the language barrier, period. You've got F.W. Murnau, you've got Jean-Luc Godard, but like you largely don't have this kind of like he should be as synonymous with film studies as Hitchcock and Scorsese and all the other more modern filmmakers. and yet he's not really. He's kind of relegated, unfortunately, to this like ghetto of talking about the 20s and 30s. And it's unfortunate because we're also going to talk about While the City Sleeps, which was a first watch for me. And honestly, I'm looking at the full filmography right now, and I'm kind of ashamed to say, as a film studies teacher, that I haven't even seen half a dozen of his movies overall.
Yeah.
And it he maybe marred his reputation, his legacy over the years by kind of going for quantity over quality. So his batting average wasn't as solid as some of the filmmakers he influenced, right? Everybody from Spielberg to Kubrick and in between. But he loomed so large, it almost felt like his omnipresence was taken for granted for much of his years. And it's kind of unfortunate, not only that his legacy got a bit tarnished, but that, when he did make the move to the US and started making a lot of English language films, he got petered out. It kind of was, it was like his career ended with a whimper rather than a bang. But that's also kind of indicative to perhaps the kind of stories that he was consistently attracted to. Like you have these two Manhunt movies from very different vantage points and from very different locales and philosophies, and yet the one thing, and I'll be curious to see if my thesis holds up at the end of the episode based on what you thought, Dan, but like I was really struck by that. I was watching, so this was probably my third or fourth M watch, but I was really struck this time while watching While the City Sleeps. I was just like, oh, I think I get it now. Like Fritz doesn't just like have a strong like obsession with society and like how it breaks down and how it exploits people and uses people, but like this guy like straight up like doesn't think that there's any way to have like a morally just legal system. Like like all the systems are fucked. Like the press system in the US, the kangaroo court system of organized crime in Europe, and the police department. Like it's just he's such a cynical filmmaker in so many ways, and yet like the fact that he created these monuments ironically shows that like he's a master of his craft. So like how can a cynic be so just like inspirational? But he is.
No, definitely. I mean, it's interesting because like I come to him through a completely different lens, because I only sort of picked up on his movies when I started doing like noir watches.
I was gonna guess that. Yeah,
Woman in the Window, Scarlet Street, Big Heat. So that's kind of how I know him.
Oh God, I love Scarlet Street.
Oh, Scarlet Street's so good. It's so good. Public domain, people. It's on YouTube. Go watch it. And that's kind of how I came across him. And I love all those movies. I think they're all great. Specifically, Scarlet Street is definitely one of my favorites. And it was so like, it was really great to dive into M. And While the City Sleeps, I think I think we're going to have an interesting conversation about that one, because I was pretty floored at how much I disliked it.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is about it. I think, we can dive into it right now. It's basically, it's a newspaper procedural. Technically it's a manhunt, right? That's the theme of this season. And they are hunting a serial killer, but the core narrative of While the City Sleeps it's a newspaper movie. It's about different people within a news organization that are, in reality, trying to vie for more power within the corporation. And sort of the parallel story is that there's a serial killer they're trying to catch to get more clout in order to sort of take over control of the news division, right?
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting movie. And, there's not really a protagonist per se. There's a lot of different characters going on in it. The serial killer part is played really, for someone who has such a like illustrious career as a noir director. I mean, basically helped invent noir. It was like mind blowing how like I don't know, the serial killer element of Why the City Sleeps was not scary, not really all that creepy, and played like pretty straight on. And it almost like I don't know, it like While the City Sleeps felt like it was shot like a TV show. Right, it didn't have like those. It had a little bit of the sort of noir elements that he would have in the past, especially Scarlet Street. But it just felt really straightforward, the whole thing. And it I think more than anything, it feels like the end of somebody's career. Right? It feels like one of those films where he's just sort of done. I mean, he lived to like 76, I think. So he lived quite a while after he stopped making films. Did he move back to Germany or did he move somewhere else? I think he left the United States. Right?
Yeah, he did leave the U.S. This was his second to last American film. He made Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. And then made just 3 more pictures back in Europe. It does seem like he was kind of I mean, I think that was part of the deal with this last run of movies is he kind of did the thing where you get huge and so you leave your home, you try to become this like global phenomenon, and it didn't pan out. At least for too long, right? He kind of, The Big Heat was kind of his last, huge release, which was still like nowhere near the heights that he had reached, 10, 20 years earlier. But he I don't know. I've never heard of any of these movies. The Indian Tomb, The Tiger of Eshbanar, The Thousand Eyes of Dr. Mabuse. It almost seems like he kind of went to B-movie town.
Well, I think what happened is, if you ever had a chance, there's a great series, I think it's weekly series on AMC called Noir Alley. And they featured this film While the City Sleeps on there, and Eddie Moeller, I think is his name. He does like all the intros, amazing intros, like really well researched. His intro on this is like super fascinating because he basically talks about like how Lang basically had burned every bridge in Hollywood, and like he couldn't find any money to do movies anymore, essentially. And he came across a producer that basically gave him a 2-picture deal, While the City Sleeps and Beyond Reasonable Doubt. But it sounds like he was really, really tough to work with. Extreme perfectionist, an autocrat on set, very unpleasant to work with overall. It kind of sounds like he just ran out of luck. Not ran out of luck, but like burned all his luck. By the time you get to these, these last American films in the mid 50s. I don't know, the film itself. I mean, what did you think of it? Like, have you seen it before?
No, this was my first watch, and I kind of maybe hyped it up too much in my head because not only do I teach film studies, I also teach journalism, and so I was like, all right, here we go, Fritz Lang journalism movie, and also a serial killer element. But yeah, I think the overall kind of flat look of it was really just surprisingly disappointing because he's such a master of mood and like literally from the original school of German expressionism. And he became cantankerous. I also think that, as happened with a lot of the European filmmakers that moved to Hollywood, it kind of sucks the life out of you, right? Yeah. Where it's like that Hollywood system is antithetical. Like, it created tons of amazing films, but it is also very unlike, like, aggressively antithetical to European sensibilities. And so I think that's one of the things that kind of fell on it. I read one interesting analysis that argued that, whether intentional or not, that TV look that you refer to added to the effect of it being like a piece diving into American media. It not only like is a newspaper movie, but it's Vincent Price horribly miscast as a new mogul, like, who had inherited this enterprise, and then makes it a contest essentially between the three divisions: TV, news, and radio or wire service, to see who was going to catch the killer first. Because that's the one part of it I did like, is like, okay, 20 some years later, Fritz does realize that the American police are just as useless as the European police. When you see that kind of interplay, it almost comes across, especially in the first half of the film, as more like a screwball comedy type feel.
Well, yeah, there's
right?
definitely comedic elements going on.
Yeah, yeah,
kind of odd.
Right.
I didn't laugh. They weren't funny.
No, not funny. But yeah. I have to admit, I did find it watchable. I did. I think that despite the unfortunate look of it, whether or not you think it's appropriate considering the material that's at hand, the thing that Lang is always like, even going back to the silent era, he knows how to imbue this kind of sense of like you don't want to look away from the actors, and he knows how to cast them. He did that. That was one of the appeals for me anyways. And I'm realizing that I've only seen of his noirs, Scarlet Street and The Big Heat. But in both of those, I think one of the selling points that helps it stand out from the bunch is like Edward G. Robinson is just magnetic in Scarlet Street, and then Glenn Ford in Big Heat.
Yeah,
is that right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And it's just that kind of like almost like smoldering attitude, but like, yeah, because he tries to play it lighter, and he tries to like play it almost like bordering on satire, especially with like the hammy presence of Vincent Price, everything kind of becomes off kilter. Ida Lupino, though, she's amazing. I think that she puts more into the role than is given to her as the kind of kind of like femme fatale light character, I guess you would say.
Yeah. Definitely light, L-I-T-E.
Yeah, L-I-T-E, for sure. And Rhonda Fleming. And that's the thing that I did kind of take away ultimately, is like, it did take Lang a while to figure out what to do with women actors in his movies. And, I think that that's a silver lining to this kind of overall mess of a movie, is that you finally saw some of that screwball element kind of get turned on its head and become a little more serious. It's unfortunate that it doesn't really tie together well or cohesively at all. And even though, last thing I'll say for first impressions is like, you're totally right that the killer is just like stock character. And they blame all these horrible regressive reasons for why he's doing this. But it is interesting that this is 4 years before Psycho, and it's like you've got the mama's boy, and so it's like
same elements.
And that's what we had in Trap. So like there's a direct line from our first episode to our last episode, and we're always blaming the mom. And yeah, it's just too bad that while that was clearly like the beginnings of some sense, and there's like obviously heavy at least narratively, not tonally, but narratively, like Zodiac elements here too. That it's just too bad that I could see a version of this film that could have like been a lot more serious, a lot more like the melodrama type, and heavy shadows and more cinematic. And it just sucks that unfortunately they went the route of like the traditional Hollywood, like toe the line kind of mood.
It is such a weird mood choice, right? Because it's like the script was based on a novel, The Bloody Spur, which came out in 1953. That was based on real life serial killer in Chicago called Lipstick Killer. So there's elements here where they could have taken it way darker, and it just, for whatever reason, he just didn't want to go that route, or I don't know. It's really bizarre, the tone that he chose. I think it had something to do with the focus on the news aspect of it, where he wanted to focus most of the camera on the newsroom. I think the original title was News is Made at Night, I think was the original title of the movie. So heavily focused on the newsroom. Luckily we got better movies that came along that focus on that. Sweet Cell of Success, Burt Lancaster, genius. But and I think like going back to like the source material a little bit, in the source material, and this is something that Eddie Miller brought up in Noir Alley, is that the motivation of the killer in the book is the Bible. And it's comic books. Yes. And there's some great if you ever want to like find background on films, one of the sources I always go to is AFI. If it's before like 1999, I think they have all these great primary documents for these films, and there's a couple of variety articles from 55 about this movie. And essentially, like, there's this big movement by a U.S. senator in the mid 50s to sort of blame comic books for juvenile delinquency.
Yeah. It was the original video game.
Right, the original video game. So much so. And we sort of wonder, like, why did this film come out the way that it did? This senator actually viewed the film before it was released and gave them dialogue changes. To quote, and this is the quote, use the production as a, quote, weapon in the growing battle against the corrupting force of comic books on young minds. So, like, right there, you can kind of see, like, there's some corruption to the creative process happening here.
Yeah.
And that's, this is after it was shot. So it's like dialogue stuff. It's not the, end of the world. So they chose the tone way before this. But there's just something here when we transition over to M, which is so clearly a masterpiece on so many different levels, in the work of a very unique and confident genius. It just like floors me when someone like that, I guess it's, with time, it just happens. It doesn't happen to every, brilliant director or whatever, but it often happens. Where they either lose the desire to make something interesting or new and unique, or they just get burned down by the system or ground down by the system. And, I think Fritz was somebody who thought he was smarter than most people. And like, I'm sure that like him and the production class in Hollywood system did not mesh well at all. And I think kind of to your earlier point, like he's from a very European school of thought and filmmaking. And that doesn't jive with the Hollywood system because it was a factory. And if you didn't play ball and play the game in the right way, it would be a really unpleasant experience. Yeah. And it feels like this movie is a product of a very unpleasant experience, across the board. It just, despite like the actors showing up, although it sounds like they were like, a lot of them were drunk half the time.
Oh, right. Yeah. That comes across.
They're actually drinking in the scenes. Those aren't like prop drinks.
Right.
They had fun. It was enjoyable. I don't know if this movie could have ever been good. It is, and it took me a long time I probably sat down 4 different times to get through this thing. Yeah. Back to The Running Man all over again. And it's like, there may have been some, initial genesis of a great movie or an interesting film, but you said you were engaged. I was so not engaged.
The cast is what kept me engaged, though, and
the cast is wonderful.
Yeah, they're just like, that I was gonna say before I found out about the alcohol, like they're having a good time, like but yeah, it's arguable for sure that only added to like the mishmash of tone that was going on. The thing that I'm just kind of putting together as I was poking around on Wikipedia as you were talking, I'm realizing that one of the reasons that a lot of people think that M and Metropolis kind of stand out from his filmography is because those are the 2 films that he also did with his first wife, who was what's her name, Thea Gabrielle von Arbo, and they divorced in 1933. But then also she died in 54, probably like right before this movie goes into production. And, you know, armchair psychiatry notwithstanding, but like, I can't imagine what that's like to, you know, make your two indelible pieces during like a hectic transition of the industry with your romantic partner, and then, you know, you divorce and then she dies and you're stuck in Hollywood trying to make this movie that has, you know, thematic connections to your breakout talkie hit in 31. I don't know. That seems like a lot. And I think that one of the things that she became most known for, Van Arbo, was her contributions specifically to the scripts for both Metropolis and M. When it came to like getting across, she was a novelist originally, so she specifically helped Lang like translate the basically the, you know, the original like show don't tell rule of screenwriting, right? So as a novelist, you know, you're able to show anything you want with narration, and luckily, you know, neither Metropolis nor M messed around with that, but in very different ways, right? Because Metropolis, and it was almost like just standard for silent films at that time to just have this ongoing, you know, intertitle card keeping the through line of the story, unless it was like a comedy, like a Buster Keaton film. But in terms of like dramas, and she was able to kind of eschew that, and then to even a greater degree, like that, what some of the things about M that make it so significant as a talkie is that it still had so much restraint that you know, silence is just as important as sound in that film. And to the point where like I kept like in my rewatch here, I had been having some audio issues a few weeks ago with my television, and like it would switch off to a different input, and I thought for sure I had fixed it. And even though I had seen this movie a couple times before, I was watching it, and like when it would go for those long stretches of silence where they were just like kind of showing, you know, everything from diagrams, maps, and blueprints of the office building where he was hiding out to, you know, the Laurie just silently following the girls in the streets. I legit thought like, wait, did my audio go out again? Like, but it's so masterful. And I think one of the reasons that it is, compared to like While the City Sleeps, which is just chock full of talking, right? Like it's just wall to wall dialogue, to the point where it feels that like overstuffed quality to it. And M doesn't do that at all, while still having a pretty large cast of characters, like While the City Sleeps does. And that's just it, you know, part and parcel of that kind of unfortunate descent that afflicted the whole industry before, you know, we finally had this kind of rebirth of Restraint in the 60s to make a nod to, for instance, Bullet, which we talked about last episode, or even in European cinema like Le Samurai.
Yeah, no, I mean, the thing about M versus While the City Sleeps is product of two different eras, two different systems, without a doubt. But I do think that like it's one of those things where, as someone I've not seen a ton of films before 1940. 1940 is kind of like my cutoff and has been for a long time. It is pretty mind blowing what was going on in a movie like M, in the sense that not only from a technical aspect, you talk about the use of sound and the camera work, those are all really interesting and foundational things within filmmaking that happened in M. I think more importantly to me, at least in my takeaway in viewing it, is the desire to probe these really undesirable and unpleasant aspects of life. And not only being courageous in doing that, but also illuminating a lot about human psychology and group psychology, that I felt, there was some of that in While the City Sleeps, in the sense that corporate environments, whether they be a newsroom or like whatever, a factory, there's just this inherent competition and kind of interpersonal violence that is always happening no matter what, because of the system that has created these institutions. So that's there in While the City Sleeps. But like, I think it felt, to your point earlier, it felt pretty cynical. And cynicism, I think, often is kind of flaccid, right? It doesn't really, it points out things that are wrong, but doesn't really say there's a way to fix it.
Sure.
And I think with M, it didn't seem cynical at all to me.
Really?
Even though it's essentially doing the same thing.
Yeah. It's
pointing out these truths about living in a society where the police and the organized crime and, you know, how we think of children and how we treat children. And, you know, there's a lot of just unblinking emotion in what he's expressing and intelligence in what he's expressing. But it never felt cynical in the sense that there's kind of like no hope or there's no way out, or, you know, I think to me, it felt very, very different than While the City Sleeps. While the City Sleeps, I think is right. You're right. Very cynical. But I think cynicism has this, I'm standing on the sidelines element to it. And I'm pointing at things and saying, this is wrong, that's wrong, this is wrong. I'm not doing anything about it. Nor do I really, quote unquote, care. But I'm just pointing out the flaws in society. M feels more like an exploration, and he's almost in awe of what he's discovering in a way. And I think it got like this script, obviously, it starts with the script. But yeah, you know, I think at the ending of that film, we don't really find out what happens to the killer, right? We don't. Like, it ends, and he basically gets saved by the sort of the police and the justice system, and then it kind of cuts off before we get the final finale, the verdict.
Right. And I think that's where I get a lot of that, and just the whole kangaroo court scene feels so just confidently cynical that I mean, I think, I don't know, I often don't like to see cynicism in movies as or in narrative at all, any kind of narrative art, inherently like easily dismissed, because there's, I think, moral, philosophical, and just like humanistic aspect of cynicism that feels like it would be dishonest to completely discount it. And I think that what, for me, sets apart M from While the City Sleeps is like its exactness, its precision, and that story. I mean, I think there's a very, if that movie had ended with him getting caught by the police and going, the traditional route, which is odd because it predates all the like traditional procedural stuff, right? With a courtroom, third act or whatever. Then it seems like such a deliberate choice to have the killer's future determined by, or almost determined by, another killer, right? Like this, or this syndicate of people. This idea of like the mob vigilante. I almost feel like there's, it's kind of like looking at the sanitized versus unsanitized reading of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right? Where it's like, we know the more famous pop culture, or just like even on the more basic level, like Grimm's fairy tales or Aesop's fables, like we've been conditioned, especially in America, over more than a century, to like think that these stories have some kind of just conclusion that helps propagate morals and a code throughout our culture. But at its heart, and this is, I think, where so many of these Manhunt movies get lost, kind of like The Running Man, right? Or Logan's Run, or even like The Bourne Identity to some extent. You have a very clear notion of, okay, well, if the system's against you, then you go against the system and tear it all down. But like the system itself exists to tear people down and to like propagate that system. And so like I find that to be a lot more telling and also a lot more interesting just than even what like it goes back, and we talked about this with Bullet as well. It's like one of the reasons that movie works is because it's a character who's, even though, you know, the on the surface, this rogue element in this system that has failed over and over again, and in the end he just kind of resigns himself to his house or to his apartment with his lover, and it's like, this is just what it is, and you're going to have to wake up and do it all over again. And so I think that's where like the cynicism is depressing, but is a lot more, I don't know, thematically useful and rich than While the City Sleeps brand of cynicism, which seems a lot more just like haphazard, drunken, like
it feels blasé. It's like blasé cynicism.
Yeah.
I think with, like, in switching, focusing a little bit more on M, the fact that Lang decided to dive into the mind of someone who any society would consider to be the most evil monster that could exist, a child killer, that says something to me that he had some deeper
I see what you're saying.
Drive, like, in sort of exploring those aspects of the world. Whereas, like, you know, I think to me that's what I get out of it. It's not necessarily against cynicism. It's more, you know, when you're younger and you protest things because you care a lot. It kind of feels like that. Like, he cared a lot about depicting like Berlin society and the stratification, and, you know, how the, you know, like some of the scenes that stick out to me are the false, you know, accusations, and then the crowd like riles themselves up and, oh, he must be the killer, and they start grabbing these people. You know, I think in M, there's a very strong conviction that Lang is trying to get across that's completely missing in like his, I think, even something like The Big Heat. I'll have to admit, like, there's not really there's not, it's a great noir movie, but there's not a lot of deep conviction there where there is with, you know, with M. And I think that, like, to me, more than anything, that feels like a different, maybe it is cynicism on some level. But I almost find it hard to argue that it's truly cynical. Anybody who's willing to dive into the mind of a child killer.
Yeah. So
because like true cynicism would be like, well, you know, monster, like whatever. Oh, the world's filled with monsters, blah, blah, blah. Like the typical kind of response or something like that.
So, so I'd like to officially revise my thesis then. I think what it's cynical of, the societal systems, is distinctly different than what it's not cynical of, which is the human condition. And you're right, like that passion there for this notion of like it's borderline comical, right? And we know there's like this thin line between comedy and horror, where you have this cut from, you know, that beautiful cut where like the what we assume is the police officer's hand or detective's hand on Peter Lorre's shoulder, and right before that, you know, you had a mother screaming like he must die, and then cut to mother like sobbing on the courtroom bench being like, we're never going to get our kids back. Like that's kind of, I think, a good distillation of this feeling of systems will not save us, but like the human condition, unfortunately, is to suffer, and that deserves empathy. So I think it's, and that's part of the brilliance of it, is that it toes the line. It kind of reminds me of Memories of Murder in that sense, because that's, you know, another like masterful towing the line between tones, where it's like you see the like rage and depression in the detective's eyes, as much as you see like this comedic juxtaposition of you know, I'm never gonna I'm never gonna catch this killer. I've failed my whole city, and so now I'm just gonna go sell juicers in a minivan. Like,
yeah, that's there's a very clear perspective in that suggests the systems that we have built to organize ourselves and to create things like justice, and to, you know, also inebriate ourselves and give ourselves joy. You know, organized crime, sex, drugs, everything in between. Jazz music, I'm sure back then.
comic books.
I mean, comic books. I think there's this element in M where those systems, it's like he's saying they're corrupt, but we already, you know, everybody knows they're corrupt in a sense, and they're incomplete and they're imperfect. But I think in M, it's so powerful because he makes, you know, the main character a murderer. Is he the protagonist? I guess he's the protagonist.
Well, yeah, that's another question I wanted to bring up, because that's how I had always remembered the film. And honestly, like this was my, I think it was my third watch. But I don't think I've watched it in over a decade plus. And so much of my memory of the film is Peter Lorre, because he's so memorable, and just like, you know, commands the screen every time he's let in it. But like this time, my rewatch, I was like, the whole first half of the film, maybe like the first third, is like, wow, like when do we actually see Peter Lorre's face? Like
what, 45 minutes or something?
Right.
You hear him whistle before, obviously.
Right, the whistle. Oh my god, the whistle is fun. Like, and I actually, that's a good demarcation, I think, because I remember watching The Wire for the first time, and Omar's whistle in The Wire is similarly ominous, and that made me think of Peter Lorre and M. But yet that's the thing, is like a lot of these films that we watched this season, and this is how we kind of set up our format, was that we were looking at from the perspective of the hunter versus from the perspective of the hunted, and that line got blurred a lot, even in that very first episode. And here it's like, yeah, I mean, he is like, I think it's another like smart screenplay choice to almost psych us out to think that we are going to just like be following from like neighborhood mom to police officer to organized crime boss, as like this kind of overarching, like looming, omniscient protagonist of just like good, quote, good society. And then when we make that hard turn to like Peter Lorre's on the run now, then it's like, wait a second, like this is a person too. Like the way that everybody else is acting is like how everybody else was thinking how Peter Lorre was acting. So it also creates that like Frankenstein dynamic that way too, just like by bifurcating the narrative in such a extreme way, which I think is another kind of thing that got lost over the years, including in Fritz Lang's own filmography. There's no like exciting storytelling choices like that. I mean, you kind of mentioned this when you got done with your first watch. I remember you texted on our friend Slack saying like, maybe Hollywood was a mistake. Like maybe we went a complete wrong direction with this whole cinema thing.
Well, I mean, there's something to like say about, I mean, obviously, you know, cinema was in the early stages at this point, but the experimentation, the daringness, the confidence. I don't know that I've seen a movie recently that goes this far. I mean, we have this thing where experimental filmmakers or indie filmmakers now do shocking things, which is not the same thing.
No.
So I think, yeah, it's actually very jarring. It was very jarring to watch it because I'm going in thinking, you know, it's in the 30s. It's going to be so not deep and just sort of like skimming along the surface. Like the sound's not going to be great. The picture quality is going to be, you know, suffering because of it's been degraded over years. But I sat down and watched this thing, and it's totally engrossing, amazing, interesting story. And I think some of the best cinema often, you know, it's that thing where it illuminates something about human nature and our existence that hasn't maybe been said in this exact way before. I think M is a good example of that. You basically have a child killer at the end who comes across as almost sympathetic.
Yeah.
Like sympathetic in the sense that he's desperate, he's pathetic. He, you know, is saying that he's not doing it because he wants to do it. He's doing it because he has these urges to do it. And Lang makes it seem like that as the protagonist, we should listen to him. We should hear him out. We should actually try and understand how this person is doing such horrific things, which is just amazing that he's even attempting to do that in 1931.
Yeah.
And it's also like it's also a total like psychological mind-blowing thing to realize this is the Weimar Republic. This is before the Nazis took over.
Yeah.
As they were starting to take over, like in the really beginning stages. And that scene with, you know, in the basement with all the organized crime people and this huge mob, you're watching this and you're like, this actually did happen.
Right. Yeah. Cut to 1941.
Like this, it was happening, you know, maybe not concurrently when it was shot, but right afterwards, the Nazis started to step in and take a lot of power very quickly. And they used that exact model of getting a group of people to scapegoat somebody. You know, obviously, and the Nazis, it was the Jewish people. But I think, like, even us talking about this in a movie that came out in 1931, it's just, it is mind-blowing. Because there's such a level of artistry. Like, I'm not even talking about the technical parts of it. And we could talk about that like on another podcast episode. Just the story, just the
tracking
willingness
shots,
to dive into it. Yeah, it's just crazy. And it's you know, I think the thing that kind of stuck with me watching it and going back to this theme of cynicism, which I think is accurate, because ultimately, like, one of the foundations of noir, I think the thing that makes something noir to me personally when I'm watching something is the sense that fate will will out and win over no matter what you do. And I think there's a sense here that the protagonist, as this killer, he's not in control of what he's doing, is what Lang is suggesting. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but he's suggesting that he's not in control of what he's doing. And because of that, all of these horrific and awful things he's doing and are going to happen to him afterwards, it's all out of his control. Like, that's one of the pillars of the genre, is that no matter what you do, you're kind of screwed. So yeah, I guess it is pretty cynical at the end of the day, because it's like you have no control or power over what's about to happen.
So we both revised our theses a little bit.
We both landed in the same exact spot. But I think, but you brought this up earlier. How you react to that powerlessness, I think, is where things tend to deviate. Do you get drunk at a bar at 11 a.m. like they're doing in While the City Sleeps? Or do you try? I don't know. There's something to that, like how reacting to that perhaps reality that we don't have much control over what's happening in the world directly around us, and even in the world inside of us. And so I think that's, you know, one of the main traits that I'm seeing, I think, obviously in both movies.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, there's something to be said for a filmmaker who, even as he kind of loses sight of his craft, still retains kind of that skeleton. I mean, we wouldn't even watching While the City, like, it took us a while to find the existence of this movie, right? Because full disclosure, anyone who's listening out there, we were pretty set on doing a Rear Window for a good minute, because of obvious, like, the voyeur aspect of Jimmy Stewart metaphorically hunting down what's going on across the apartment building courtyard, but that it felt kind of weak. And also we'd done a Hitchcock finale with Frenzy just a few seasons ago, and so we were looking through, like, 1950s serial killer movies, 1940s manhunt movies. What else is out there? And eventually we found that Fritz Lang had circled back to the genre to some degree, and it was curious enough that we landed on it. So I think there's something to that's why I don't think it's like a total loss at the end of the day. Because that's the mark of a great filmmaker, is that even their missteps have, like, that DNA in them that make them fascinating to think about and talk about. But M, still, like, it bears repeating that, like, we're going to come across that film's 100th anniversary in less than a decade, and we have seen so much happen with this genre over the years. Maybe we should do a quick recap before trivia.
Sure.
Dan, I'll say my most surprising watch and my most surprising rewatch for the season, to make my point, and then maybe you can do the same.
Sure.
So my most surprising first watch was Le Samurai, and I think that plays into M really nicely, because unlike so many of the other films, with the exception of Trap, which I'll die defending, but it's able to place you in this protagonist's or this killer's head in a way that it's a form of radical empathy, right? Even with someone as detached and emotionless as our assassin in Le Samurai. Because I didn't think that was possible. I thought that it even, like, been so overdone, right? The calm, cool, collected killer, but the way that that is framed in Le Samurai, while tonally completely different from M, does the same kind of, like, just upends your thinking of right and wrong, of who's the hunter and who's the hunted, how they're essentially one and the same. That was my most surprising watch. My most surprising rewatch, however, was Hunt for the Wilder People, which I had loved. I'd seen it twice before and just thought it was a perfect film. And then when you and Harry of Trilove came on and kind of started helping me see the seams that were kind of left broken narratively, there's not much going on there, and it was so much about the characters and the performances that made me fall in love with it. And then as soon as you kind of realize that it's just kind of like a hangout movie that happened to have, like, some really good emotional beats in it, it kind of shows you that how much of that empathy piece can just be accidental, or can be like the viewer's unintended reading too much into, or like falling into the traps of cinema, and falling for the tricks in there. So I mean, that's honestly the last thing I thought that we would end on, is this concept of radical empathy with a Manhunt series. I thought we were going to be talking a lot more about form and genre, but in many ways, this is kind of like the the most emotional we've gotten on this podcast.
I
Maybe.
love it. It's
Yeah.
great. It's great for us. We're breaking through the layers of defense mechanisms. So I think the most surprising first watch for me is definitely Bullet.
Yeah.
And it's not even necessarily because it's just the legacy of that film is so set around Steve McQueen, the car chase. And that's why I went into it kind of figuring it's going to be this kind of action movie. It's like whatever kind of throwaway thing, but it's not that. I mean, there's so many kind of layers into that film, and just the style and the naturalism of it and the long takes, that sort of European style was amazing and illuminating, and it made me realize that. And what's funny is I tried to again go find resources to. I always do this when I find a movie that I love. I want to go find someone else who loves it just as much as I do in the same way.
Yes.
And I couldn't find much on Bullet. And so it is one of those movies where you look for stuff on Bullet, and it's a lot about, it's the car, it's Steve McQueen, it's these cultural icons that exist almost outside of the film itself that have overpowered its legacy to make it seem like it's just a cool action movie when there's so much more happening in that film. So I really love that as a first watch. In terms of the rewatch that surprised me the most, Born Identity.
Yeah.
This is a
That's
movie
a good one.
that I saw it, I think probably opening weekend, or at least the first month when it came out. Really enjoyed it, loved it. It felt fresh, it felt new. I saw the subsequent ones for the most part, from what I can recollect. And then this one, Born Identity, is on TBS. It's one of those movies that's always just around. But watching it this time, I think one of the things that happened in the early 2000s is filmmaking got so bombastic and over the top. Anytime when someone returned to sort of meat and potatoes genre and just did point A to point B to point C, it felt very different and new. Think of like the Strokes or something in music. Like it just felt this like, whoa, this is crazy that you can make this movie so like tight and clear and not a lot of like CGI explosions and all this extra stuff going on. Just a really pure story. And Born Identity feels that way to me. It feels like a tight, well constructed story. It's well shot. I think it's interesting. The action scenes in that. But ultimately, just it fizzles to me because unlike a movie like M or Bullet or Les Samurai or Apocalypse Now or Manhunter or Cure, there's not another layer going on there.
Yeah.
It's just, that's it. It's just the frosting on the cake, and there's no actual cake. And I think that's one of those things where like it really surprised me, because when I was younger, that to me was a great thing, where there wasn't this undercurrent. It's just this straightforward, action movie. Whereas now, and seeing it again, it's like, yeah, it's fun and it's great, but it's not like any of these other movies that we're talking about, because it doesn't want to be. It just wanted to be an action movie. And I think that's one of the things that, like, watching these films, you can often tell what the intention of the director and writer and editor and everybody involved. It's always clear when there's a heightened intention versus when there's not. And it's clear as day. And you can kind of tell that, like, in The Running Man, there wasn't, it was a fun movie where they blew up a lot of stuff and had a lot of fun, and it's engaging and interesting and a good time. You compare that to Manhunter, which, I didn't necessarily love on this rewatch. Like, I've loved it before, but there's so much intention into that. Like, trying to do something different, say something different, trying to make something unique. And I think that's kind of my takeaway from a lot of these films is, going back to the auteur theory, intention. What are you trying to do?
Yeah.
And I think it's great to sort of end with M versus While the City Sleeps, because I think we can see it there. And M, there's this compulsion to say something interesting, to get out something that he wants to say. While the city sleeps, he's basically cashing a check.
Yep.
And just, saving up money to get out of the United States and go retire somewhere, right?
Right. Yeah. That is a good. It was a happy accident that we ended up showing the spectrum on the season finale, even within the same director's filmography. But just like every other episode, we need to end with some trivia. Are you ready, Dan?
Let's do it. We're doing locations, right?
Yep. So I'm giving you locations because we're trying to find out where the man is that we're hunting. These are all pre-1960 Manhunt films that we obviously did not cover in today's episode. And you've got a graphic in front of you of 12 possible titles, and we're going to see if you fare better on your own than you did with our guests throughout the season. Here we go. Number one. Ohio River, West Virginia. Moundsville Penitentiary.
Night of the Hunter?
Yeah. Okay. I had to tee you up with a gimme to start it off. They're following down the river. That movie, I think, why didn't we do it for just because we were so set on M? Right?
I think so. Yeah. It was definitely on the list of what we're considering. We didn't go for it.
If for whatever reason you haven't treated yourself to that, please do. Number 2. Santa Rosa, California. Uncle Charlie's Farm.
Uncle Charlie's Farm. Shadow of Doubt? No.
Yeah, there you go.
Is it?
Yeah. Another classic.
Santa Rosa is the giveaway, I think. I just watched this like 2 months ago.
Right. Another reason I wanted to make sure to put it in here. That and I think I need to rewatch it now because that's now like one of your favorite Hitchcocks, good. Right?
So good.
Yeah. Joseph Cotton, what a guy. All right. Number 3. You're doing great. You're 2 for 2, Dan. New York City. Professor Henry Jared's Museum.
House of Wax?
Yeah, there you go. Nice one.
Museum.
Yeah. Vincent Price, once again, if you want to watch a better Vincent Price film, the original House of Wax is a treat, as is arguably the remake with Paris Hilton. No? Is that going?
It's worth watching. It's worth
bridge
watching.
too far. Yeah, no, it's trashy fun.
Yeah.
Number 4. Oh my gosh, are you gonna have a?
I think I've kind of maxed out the ones that I've seen.
Let's see. Brooklyn, New York. The Brewster family ancestral home.
House on Haunted Hill?
Nope. No, I'm not going to do 2 Vincent Prices in a row. So it all takes place at the Brewster family home. Let me see if I can give you some more details. There's a scene in which a child imitates charging up the San Juan Hill. Teddy Roosevelt yelling, "Charge!" But yeah, I mean, we're in the study where it's like a classic Clue style movie.
Spiral Staircase?
Nope. Good guess though.
I'm done. I don't know.
The characters are in this home for this. It's for a Halloween party.
Is that House on Haunted Hill?
No.
Like
You might kick yourself. Actually, I guess I don't know technically, officially, if you've seen this movie.
Probably not.
The main couple are itching to leave on they're newlyweds. They're itching to leave on their honeymoon to Niagara Falls.
The Killers?
Nope.
Bucket of Blood?
Nope.
Diabolique?
No.
Arsenic?
Arsenic and Old Lace. Have you seen it?
What? No idea what it is.
Oh my gosh. It's an incredible film. It's Capra. yeah, Cary Grant is it might be my favorite Cary Grant performance, actually.
I'll have to
Yeah,
watch it. I've never,
yeah.
and
Oh,
I
it's so
think I've
fun.
heard of it, but it
Perfect
definitely was not
Halloween
all that
movie,
familiar.
but not like an actual monster film. Yeah. Okay. So that was rough, but that's okay. We're gonna follow it up. What should I do for number 5? Yeah, I'm gonna just have to go with what I had planned. I don't know if you've seen this one either. Sunk Cloud Haute de Seine in the Paris metropolitan area. It's a boarding school. There you go. Okay.
I think I've seen that. I've seen parts of that one.
Yeah, that's another great one.
I started to watch this, and then I got bored and turned it off. I know.
No!
I got to go back to it.
Yeah, that's another movie. I wanted to do that one for sure because, like, While the City Sleeps, it was a precursor to Psycho for sure. Well, Dan, this was a very successful season, and I thought that it was going to be hard to top or meet the heights of our camp cinema season prior.
Yeah, I thought we kind of backed ourselves into a corner, which is kind of the fun of it, though.
Oh, right? Yeah, like, totally.
When you do that, you kind of have to stretch a little bit more, and we're finding movies that, like, I want to pick stuff that's a little bit off the beaten path, like One False Move, something that I had never even heard of before, and just like exploring, different films, different countries, and stuff like that. It ended up being a really fun season. Where, like with camp cinema, you could come away with like some sort of thesis. I think with Manhunt, it's a little bit tougher to like focus on the Manhunt part of it and have a thesis about it.
Right.
But in a weird sense, we have thesis, like we both have our own sort of different kind of hypothesis about filmmaking and the history of it after reviewing these films that has nothing to do with the Manhunt part of it, right?
Yeah.
It's a completely different viewpoint that we had before, which is kind of the point of why we do this, right? So I think,
right.
It was fun kind of stretching a bit and seeing things in a different way.
Agreed. Can we tease what we're planning for after the new year?
You've already added the tab. You're always the first to add the tab.
Yeah, I'm all about. I love this this stage where we have to go on hiatus, which means fewer conversations with you on the mic, but a great time to start planning out both our guests and our titles for our new theme. Go for it, Dan. Tell the people what we're doing.
We haven't. It hasn't been finally decided.
That's true.
It's going to focus on remakes, and I think the idea is that we'll probably do a remake and then the original in a single episode.
Correct.
And so, it's going to be really fun. It's it's going to be interesting what we choose. There's a lot. Like I was looking at the 1980s. There's so many in the 80s.
I know. There's so many.
Like insane. The Blob, The Fly, like The Thing. Yeah. Like it's all the things. But yeah, so it should be a really fun season doing remakes. And we'll probably be back. I think in December is probably we'll be back with season 15 of Film Trace. Thanks for listening. This has been Film Trace.